All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third Tuesday Timely Topic at noon, brought to you by the Link Center here at UWS. My name is Amber, and I am a voter and community engagement intern for the Link Center, and I will be facilitating today's event, which we have titled To Trust or Not to Trust, Exploring Biases, Objectivity, and Subjectivity in Information Sources. With us today is an amazing panel here to discuss what biases, objectivity, and subjectivity are, how they pertain to research and finding sources, and how students can use this insight in determining whether or not to trust a source. Our first panel member is Dr. Allison Wyglis. Dr. Wyglis received her Bachelor of Arts in Cinema Studies from New York University and her PhD in Film Studies from the University of Iowa. Her research focuses on experimental film and television production and on feminist film theory. She is currently working on a manuscript for Palgrave Macmillan entitled The Other Side of Television, Experiments in Broadcasting at WNET's Television Laboratory, which embeds the story of the TV Lab's production of experimental video art and documentaries from 1972 to 1984 within a larger history of art, experimentation, and social change within PBS, New York City, and across the United States. Dr. Wyglis has also published work in Camera Obscura, Black Camera, and the Millennium Film Journal. We also have Stephanie Warden. Stephanie has 9 years of experience in special, for-profit, and academic libraries, and 5 years of experience teaching introductory courses in information literacy. She is currently serving as a peer reviewer for the upcoming publication, the OER Starter Kit for Program Managers. Her current research interests include culturally sensitive pedagogies and personal data information literacy. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jamie White-Farnham. Dr. White-Farnham earned her PhD in English, Writing, and Rhetoric at the University of Rhode Island. She is the director of the Jim Danhill Library and Markwood Click. She is also an associate professor and writing coordinator here at UWS. She has written a book and several articles and chapters, most of which relate to writing and rhetoric. Her vast areas of knowledge include writing, academic writing, business writing, rhetoric, how people advocate for themselves using rhetoric, persuasion, argument, language changes, grammar, English language use, and change. So thank you all so much for being here. We will get started right with the first question, which, what are some of the definitions of the terms that we're talking about today? So that biases, objectivity, and subjectivity.
So I'll start with the idea of biases, which I think often ends up getting thrown around as a sort of dirty word in the media and in research more broadly, but really simply put, just means some kind of prejudice in favor of one thing or another. And putting it that way should make it really clear that it's almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to avoid some kind of bias within the space of research. And that's not always inherently a bad thing. But I think, again, when we use this term colloquially in the media, we're often thinking about political biases or partisan biases. So I just want to give a few other examples of biases that exist within the world of the broader media and within academic research that do still have a lot of traction and maybe take us outside of that political sphere. So for example, you can have a commercial bias, and that's really present within journalism and within academic research more broadly. Anytime that you apply to publish a book, for example, there's going to be a section that asks, how is it going to be marketed? And so there's an expectation that what you write about does need to have some kind of market. There tends to be a bad news bias, and that we tend to really favor news that's more traumatic or unsettling. And I think we've all noticed that increasingly this last year. I've had so many students tell me they avoid the news for this very reason because of the focus on the news. There also tends to be visual and narrative biases, right? Stories that are easier to form into a actual story, a coherent narrative, tend to get more traction than something that has a lot of competing factors and influences and needs a lot of context. And similarly with a visual bias, something that seems splashier, easier to circulate is something that does tend to get more traction. And there are obviously more biases than these, but I think this hopefully gets us past the idea of thinking of bias as only partisan and into a just sort of broader range of ways that it shapes how we access information and how we receive information.
I can go next and talk a little bit about objectivity. When we talk about objectivity or objective research, I think there are two ways that we have to look at that term. The first is the connotation and then the denotation. Now, the connotation of objectivity is that there are no biases associated with it, that something that is, and it is the true thing. Generally, when we talk about objectivity in denotative terms, we're talking about research as the idea or belief that some things are true regardless of outside factors working on it. So there is somewhere objectively a one true thing that we can point to, and we don't have to worry about anything else because that thing is true. And that's a great standard to kind of shoot for, but it is unfortunately something that is not necessarily true since we're talking about truth. When we talk about objective statements, I can say something like, this pen writes in blue, and I can tell from this and from the ink that comes out of it that is supposedly objectively true. What comes out of this pen is blue. However, the color blue, even though it is objectively blue to me, is maybe not what somebody else calls blue. Maybe this is indigo. Maybe this is a different thing. And so while there is a shade of truth in it, and that my objective view of what this pen does is right in blue, it's not objectively true. Something like I am holding up 3 fingers right now. Now that's a little bit harder to be to not be objective with, because there are 1, 2, 3 fingers. That's a data point that isn't going to lie necessarily. So the 3 fingers thing, 3 tends to be objective, whereas something that is more subjective or more that we like to think is objective, but probably isn't, things like that require judgment calls. So when we talk about objectivity, especially whenever it comes to research, we have to think about it in terms of, well, yeah, that's a great standard. We want to find information that is true regardless of the outside factors acting upon it. But we also have to note our biases will change the way that we look at things, and also that our experiences are also going to color the way we look at things, no pun intended.
That's a great transition into thinking about what subjectivity is, which often when we think of the word subject, we're thinking of like a topic or like an area in school. We call them our school subjects. However, in the relationship between object, like Stephanie is talking about with the pen, and subject, you are actually the subject. Your person is the subject. So what we call your subjectivity is a combination of your roles, your point of view, your experiences, and the interpretations you bring to bear on any object, which is what the point Stephanie was making about the ink color. And so this can be true of how you interpret ink color, maybe a piece of art. If we both look at the same abstract painting, your experiences and memories and feelings would give you a different sense of it than mine collectively will give me to interpret that painting. And that's why we often call a judgment or an evaluation of things subjective, but that doesn't make it a bad word. Similar to biases, subjectivity is often misconstrued to be a bad thing. It's just a variable thing. So the problem comes when some people don't like or can't handle variable and multiple interpretations that exist at the same time of the same object. In that case, a person who might believe that their point of view or their experience is neutral or objectively true, that's where the trouble comes, because other people's subjective interpretations and understandings of the world can clash with that. And if you have a person who's in power who doesn't like the clash, that's where we get, sort of at a very high level, oppression. So when we think about maybe some of the social justice protests that are ongoing in our country that encourage people to share their stories and make their claims about what their experiences are, that can bump up against the dominant power's beliefs of what is true about the world. And then the clashes occur because people don't think that another subjectivity can be as valid or as true as theirs. So again, it's not bad, but it can cause trouble for sure.
Thank you for that, for clarifying all those terms. So how do these terms pertain to research and finding sources?
So I'm going to take this on from a slightly more abstract level and a slightly more theoretical level that just asks us to think a little bit about what we're doing when we're finding research. This actually sort of takes off from Jamie's answer to the last question about what happens when people in power don't like a kind of clash between different truths or different narratives. And so I was actually reading this morning for a class that I'm teaching this semester, a piece by John Tagg called The Burden of Representation, which is about photography and specifically the use of photography as evidence. And that's something that obviously extends to video as well, as we're seeing, just these last few weeks in the Derek Chauvin trial. But he had this sentence in here that I thought was so potent for this particular presentation, in which he writes, "Truth itself is already power, bound to the political, economic, and institutional regimes which produces it." And that's a reminder that when we're trying to think about research, when we're trying to think about truth, and when we're trying to think about the production of knowledge, it's something that is, first of all, right, produced. Second, it's inherently intermingled and produced by systems of power. And those systems of power are always political, they always have economic concerns, and they're always shaped by the institutions that they're part of. And again, this ties back to what both Jamie and Stephanie are saying about this kind of question of subjectivity and objectivity, which is really just asking us to understand that when we talk about knowledge, there's always context to production of knowledge. And a big part of what we have to do when we think about research is understand that there aren't some pure sources that we're going to find that have the unmitigated truth. But again, that truth itself is already power, and it is something that is bound to those political, economic, and institutional regimes that produce it. And so recognition of what those production sites are and how those different narratives are negotiated is a really important thing to think about, even as you're trying to cast a really wide net within your research. So that's the big picture example. I think Stephanie and Jamie are going to take us through some examples and how to mitigate this.
Yeah, I'll provide a couple of examples of how these terms pertain to research. So we're going to maybe get smaller as we go here, and Stephanie will speak to the student experience. So, but with some of the examples of power or where the truth is in research pertains to the notion that the information that is produced out there through research is not neutral or objective. It can't be, as Alison just explained, but that doesn't mean that you can't decide to trust it. And I can explain why. So we can take the recent example of the COVID mRNA vaccine, the two women who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the CRISPR technology that got us to the ability to create an mRNA vaccine. They have talked about how when they were introduced to the study of DNA and genetics, they decided to put their time and attention into CRISPR technology. So that was a completely subjective decision. It's based on their own preferences, priorities, experiences, choices, and then they bring their own unique sense of their science education to this project. So what they've produced can generally be trusted. We're trusting it right now. The FDA has decided that we can for an emergency use because it's been tested and developed within protocols agreed to by so many scientists that the process is able to counter the biases and to reduce the variation that would occur in a single subjective vacuum of development of research, right? So we try to counteract those truths, basically, the leaning towards taking something as firm truth. We try to counteract that, right? And then that allows us to sort of collectively accept that it's been checked and rechecked and rechecked. So let's take another kind of science or another kind of information in social sciences, for instance. Researchers can produce knowledge through surveys and through observations and through experiments about how people behave, for instance, like in psychology, or the probabilities of getting hurt or sick, right? That's sort of what risk scientists do. But we can't say that any of the knowledge produced is infallible or completely true, or that it will withstand every test of time of every circumstance, right? So we know that there's always going to be a margin of error. And we found out that today with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, right, that there's a margin of error that was unforeseen. We foresee it now. Science is intervening and saying, okay, wait, we have to recheck again, right? So nothing's infallible. And that's good. New people will always enter every field, science and otherwise. They bring their subjectivities, their experiences, their ability to counter someone else's bias, their personal interpretations to whatever topic that they're looking at to create knowledge, to create a product, to create a vaccine. And they'll bring that to bear on the current, question at hand. And they'll make a change in what we consider true or trustworthy. Yesterday we trusted, today we can't. It doesn't mean it's, again, impossible to determine how you should approach the process of deciding on trust. Take it away, Stephanie.
Will do. So when we're talking about all of these examples about how we have these wonderful scientists who have gone in and used their subjective experiences to inform what branch of science or what modality of science they're going to research, we also have to talk about the idea of the objective findings that led them to their conclusions. And I think that kind of feels like whenever we're doing research, either ourselves or as students or however, like there is a holy grail out there. As Jamie mentioned, the people that went on to study these things, they went on because they were open to things. It was their subjective experiences that opened their eyes to the idea of CRISPR technology. They were not looking for a holy grail, one truth to rule them all kind of thing to take them there. And if you're doing that as a student or as a researcher, if you're looking for research that is the one true thing that is objectively true, you're going to miss out on a lot of really great opportunities to find other information that might lead you to different conclusions. So I think that sometimes whenever we talk about objectivity, we hold it up as this gold standard that it really isn't. And there are additional examples of that we can point to. And we even have as Allison talked about, the way that we organize and the way that we publish information even kind of reflects that. If you write an article, even though you've gathered statistics and counted things and are using objective facts from what you've observed, the thing that you've written, that is copyright protected, because that is not just reporting on your information that you gathered, but it's also got your subjective opinions in there. You're putting your own flavor onto the data, regardless of whether you mean to or not. You may mean to just be totally objective, totally, this is the truth and nothing but the truth, et cetera, et cetera. But it will sneak in there. Data sets, on the other hand, the data that you have collected, those do not get copyright because it is objective information. It should not change. So we don't afford copyright to people who have these big data sets, numbers, things of that nature, just to kind of show that there's a difference between the production of these two types of knowledges, which is fascinating if you're a copyright nerd. So there are a lot of really, really neat things when you start to comb through the way information is presented and whether it's objective or subjective and how you need to treat it as a researcher. And I think that the balance that we've struck here in our conversation so far is to say that objective is not the guiding light. It's not the one true thing. And subjective is not the guiding light. It's not the one true thing. You need a mixture and you need to be cognizant of how they interact.
Thank you. So what can students do with this information when deciding whether to trust the source?
That's me. I think that students will want to look at the source in detail and evaluate it. I know you probably hear that word a lot, evaluate. Librarians love to say it, instructors love to say it. But what that really means is not just going through and applying some arbitrary standards from a test online. One that we see a lot is the CRAP test, which has its valid points. You evaluate whether the article is current, whether it's accurate, whether it's timely, all that good stuff. But in addition to doing that, you need to evaluate the sources within there and situate them within your discipline to understand what kind of information is being presented and in what ways those are being corrupted or twisted or misinterpreted even. So it's great that you have an article, and it's great that you that you found this thing, but you need to go through and make sure that, number one, you came by that article in a way that wasn't biased. So for example, if you were to do a search for an article, and I'll just use a term that I've seen very, very often. If you were doing a paper on marijuana and you wanted to say that there were all ill effects because you've decided on your conclusion prior to your research, if you just search for marijuana bad, you're only going to get research that says marijuana is bad. Maybe the occasional marijuana is a good thing will pop up, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're looking at an article that you found with just that search, it's guaranteed to have a particular bias, regardless of what objective information has been put in there, because you search for that. If you do it the other way, it'll be the same thing. So whenever you do searches, in order to mitigate that sort of issue with whatever source you get, you need to be able to look at it and evaluate it in the whole picture. You're going to want to use non-prejudicial search terms to get there. And then once you do find the search term that works and you find all these different articles with all these different conclusions, go in and look at who wrote it, look at what methods they used. Sometimes we use methods that pull objective data, but the methods themselves are flawed and subject to subjectivity. Somebody decided to measure something one way, but it was culturally inappropriate, or there were other things. And while there is objective data in there, there are numbers. The way by which you came to those numbers is flawed considerably. So I guess I'm basically saying to wear a tinfoil hat as you look through every single thing that you do, because it's always good to be very suspicious of your sources and to evaluate them closely.
In addition to mitigating your own personal bias that you're bringing to your search terms, and then looking at each source to determine, this evaluation Stephanie's talking about, I'm going to add on to that a little bit. So every source, every publication out there has a sponsor and an agenda. It has a reason for existing. And sometimes that reason for existing is to sell copies, right? We know that about the media. Sometimes it's evil, sometimes considered because it's trying to make money. It's not untrue, but generally speaking, in the world of academia, the purpose for existing of an academic publication is a little bit more altruistic. I mean, often the people do not get paid to write for these journals, and they make their money through subscriptions to places like our Jim Dan Hill Library, and we're the only audience sometimes. So often that money piece can be mitigated. I often show students the types of sources that we want to be using in academic research for the most part, such as high quality journalistic sources, academic research studies, the way that Stephanie is talking about, or industry publications. And we do talk about who is behind them and what their agendas are. What's the money situation? What does the publisher do? Is there an agenda behind them in the world? Like, for instance, are they supported by really well-known lobbyist groups in the United States? So if you have a research study on mass shootings that shows that they're not so bad, and then we look to see who the sponsors are, and potentially it's something like an NRA type organization, we know that there's an agenda and that there's a bias seeping through that source. And that's a very extreme example, but that is the type of relationship that you would be using in this kind of evaluation. We just look for information in and around each type of publication. And generally, you want to know whether they are transparent about their funding, purpose, and agenda, as I've just meant. And so really, the more open all those things are, clear, findable, even on Wikipedia. I mean, there's ways to like backtrack these titles. And the more consistent they are over time, and if they have a long history of being reliable in that way and open and transparent, the better, the more trustworthy.
And what Jamie and Stephanie have said about thinking about particular articles or about publications also applies to the scholars themselves, right? So one of the things we need to think about is, what is the context for any particular scholar's research? And this does happen sometimes in more hot button topics where you want to see who sponsors it. But in general, right, you might want to think about what is their training and what is their context for why they're doing what they're doing. And that usually means getting a handle on a particular discipline, and then even beyond that, particular schools within a discipline. So I, can speak to this in particular with film studies and media studies. There are, certain clusters of scholars who influence one another more than other people. And so understanding that, someone who's writing within a technological determinist perspective is likely influenced by Marshall McLuhan gives me a lot of insight into why they're writing what they're writing. And again, this is a place where subjectivity isn't something that is actually bad. It's really helpful because it's giving us new insight into what technology does, but it also means that they're probably not going to be addressing certain issues and certain things. So having that context for particular scholars, what they write, who they studied with, where their research is published, can give us a lot of information on how they're seeing a particular issue, what perspective they might be bringing to history or to sociology or to current events. And this is the other place where cross-referencing can be really helpful. So sometimes, and I know when we're in a rush doing searches, you might just want to pull the first article that you see and use that as your main source. But this is where cross-referencing is really your friend, especially for any of those more controversial topics or something that's been covered really broadly. You really want to take the time to see, well, what different angles are people bringing to this particular event? And so to bring it back to an earlier example of Jamie's with things like the vaccines right now, right? There's obviously been a lot of misinformation spread about the vaccines, but if you cross-reference scientific publications, people who actually have experience testing vaccines, the people who have worked on the vaccine, the medical journals, you'll get a pretty consistent set of answers about what is safe and what is not safe, and learn largely that things are incredibly safe. Even the Johnson & Johnson variant that got pulled today, I think there were only 6 cases of blood clots per millions of doses given at this point. And so people are acting out of an abundance of caution. But if you see on the internet tonight people saying this vaccine is a problem, we're all going to die or something, that is not a helpful source, right? Because that's coming from a bad faith argument. But this is where cross-referencing, especially with valid sourcing or sourcing with a record of promoting information that is peer-reviewed or based in studies, based on consistent data sets, is really helpful for us when we think about what we want to do as both scholars, but also what we want to teach to our students. And that sometimes involves making a lot more effort to pull in more information, but that's the only way you can really start to learn how to find your way through a field and find your way through the type of knowledge that gets circulated in the academy and in the world in a broader sense.
Thank you. So this is when we kind of want to open it up for questions from those who are attending. But in the meantime, while everyone kind of thinks about some questions that they'd like to send in the chat, is there anything else you want to talk about? Any points you want to emphasize while we wrap up here?
I think I'd like to hammer home something that's been a theme throughout all of our talks. That is that when we talk about objectivity and subjectivity and biases, we don't need to draw such sharp differences between them. These are 3 things that interact and they're a part of our everyday lives. And we want to kind of emphasize that whenever you deal in absolutes in any of those areas, it's absolutely biased, it's absolutely objective, it's absolutely subjective. That's where you run into trouble. And I think that a lot of things that we're seeing now with misinformation and disinformation, a lot of them tend to gravitate toward they're not using objective research to do this, and they're weaponizing that, which is interesting and very problematic, especially when we're also in the mainstream, we're also kind of confusing and drawing lines between those terms that maybe shouldn't be so sharp.
Yeah, I would reiterate Stephanie's point and say too, when we talk about things like knowledge being produced by institutions, it's important to remember that those institutions, I think as we've been hammering home, are people, and those people are going to bring in insights and their own subjective experience. And I feel like COVID has emerged as a bit of a theme today. And so I will say, one of, to me, the more illuminating stories about how personal bias or experience or subjective experience leads to different types of handling of crises is if you look at the history and the biography of Anthony Fauci early in his career, one of the main challenges that he faced was the AIDS epidemic, and a number of people in groups like ACT UP being incredibly critical of how the government was handling the AIDS epidemic. And a lot of what, activists pushed Fauci to do, was to sit down with them and come up with different types of trials for how we think about, vaccinating or coming up with medication for something that's an active crisis rather than just like a longer term problem that only affects a few people. And it's those trials that were pushed for by people who are acting very much within their own subjective interests, but still adhering to a rigorous scientific method that led to the types of vaccine trials that are enabling us to actually get vaccines within about a year of a crisis rather than within 3 years of a crisis. And so I think that just reemphasizes Stephanie's point that when we try to draw lines between subjective and objective, we do ourselves a disservice in sort of not recognizing that people produce knowledge and information, and those can be advantages, but they can also be weaponized. And that's what we're always trying to balance as we think about research and the circulation of information.
Yeah, my additional point speaks to this directly, that none of this should be taken as black or white, and unfortunately doesn't trickle down to practices for students as a black and white. Like as Stephanie mentioned, there are some ways that you can maybe use a checklist to check your sources or to understand their biases, but it can be, I just want to acknowledge it can be frustrating that we're explaining all these nuances, and it's just the project of education, especially at the university level, to allow there to be multiple truths going on at the same time and learn to be a productive person who can prioritize information, contextualize information, present it fairly, meaning attention to all these various factors. So not always satisfying, but the kind of project that we should be undertaking as people who are interested in education.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your insight and telling us all about. I mean, I know before this presentation today, I mean, I always thought, it was black or white. It was all objective. It's all subjective, and biases are bad. So I definitely learned a lot. So I thank you so much. If there are any questions from anyone who is in attendance, please submit it in the chat box. We also have our final Tuesday timely topic next week, where we'll be discussing the census and redistricting and how that kind of rolls out in Wisconsin. So if there aren't any further questions or any questions at all, I think we can wrap it up for today. All right. So
Thank you for having us.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for coming.